The rain battered the windows of our cramped New York apartment, each drop a tiny fist pounding against my heart. I stood by the sink, staring at the dirty dishes, wondering how I'd ended up here sharing a space with someone who barely acknowledged my existence. Last night had changed everything, and now I was drowning in the silence that followed. My name is Ethan Carter, 22, a graphic design student scraping by in Brooklyn. I'd moved into this apartment 3 months ago, desperate for a cheap place to stay. The ad had been blunt: roommate wanted. Clean, quiet, no drama. I should have known no drama was a lie when I met Lucas Reed, the 24-year-old law student who owned the lease. He was all sharp edges, high cheekbones, piercing gray eyes, and a voice that could cut glass. From day one, he treated me like I was invisible. His words clipped, his gaze always elsewhere. I told myself it didn't matter. I needed a roof, not a friend. But last night, everything shifted. It started with a bottle of cheap wine, a rare moment when Lucas let his guard down. We'd really talk for the first time. He laughed, his face softening under the dim kitchen light, and I saw someone I hadn't before, vulnerable, human. One thing led to another, and suddenly, we were tangled in his bed, the world reduced to whispers and heat. I thought it meant something. I thought it was the start of something. Morning came, and Lucas was gone. Not physically, was in the living room, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened, but emotionally. He'd vanished. "You're up," he said, not looking at me. "Coffee's on the counter." That was it. No warmth. No acknowledgement of the night before. I felt like a stranger again, a one-night thing he regretted. My chest tightened as I grabbed my towel from the bathroom, still damp from my shower, and tossed it on the couch. He didn't even glance at it. I tried to focus on my day classes, freelance gigs, the grind of city life, but my mind kept replaying last night. The way his hands had hesitated, like he was fighting himself. The way his breath caught when I kissed him. Was it all in my head? I'd grown up in a small town in Ohio, where being openly gay wasn't an option. I'd come to New York to be free, to find myself. But here I was, feeling more lost than ever. That evening, I came home to find Lucas at the kitchen table, buried in law textbooks. "Hey," I said, testing the waters. He grunted, eyes fixed on his notes. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I swallowed it down. Instead, I grabbed my sketchbook and started drawing, pouring my frustration into sharp lines and shadows. The apartment was suffocating, the silence louder than the rain outside. Then I noticed something odd. My towel, the one I'd left on the couch, was gone. I glanced around, confused. The bathroom door was ajar, and I heard the faint sound of water running. Curious, I stepped closer. Through the crack, I saw Lucas at the sink, scrubbing my towel by hand. His sleeves were rolled up, his jaw tight with focus. He wasn't just tossing it in the wash, was meticulous, rinsing it gently, like it was something precious. My breath caught. Why would he do that? I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I slipped back to my room, my heart racing. Lucas, the guy who barely spoke to me, was washing my towel with a care I'd never seen from him. It didn't make sense, but it felt like a crack in his armor, a glimpse of something he wasn't ready to show. I sat on my bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what else I'd misjudged about him. The next few days were a blur of awkward glances and stilted conversations. Lucas reverted to his cold, distant self, but I couldn't unsee what I'd witnessed. I started noticing little things, the way he'd leave coffee in the pot when he knew I was running late, the way he'd turn down his music when I was studying. Small gestures, easy to miss, but they were there. I wanted to confront him, to ask why he acted like last night never happened, But fear held me back. What if I was wrong? What if I was just another fleeting moment to him? One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I found him in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with surgical precision. "Lucas," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to talk about what happened." He froze, his knife hovering over a carrot. For a moment, I thought he'd brush me off again. But then he looked at me, while I looked at me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear. Regret. I didn't know, but it was enough to keep me from backing down. "I don't do this," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't get close to people." He set the knife down, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't understand, Ethan. I can't afford to." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. I wanted to push, to demand more, but something in his expression stopped me. This wasn't just about me. There was a story behind his walls, one he wasn't ready to tell. I nodded, stepping back. "Okay," I said softly. "But I'm here when you're ready." He didn't respond, but as I turned to leave, I caught him watching me, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me hoping. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Lucas than the cold roommate I thought I knew. The days after our kitchen confrontation felt like walking on eggshells. Lucas didn't shut me out completely, but he didn't open up either. He'd nod when I spoke, offer a half smile when I made a bad joke, but the distance between us remained a chasm I didn't know how to cross. I threw myself into my art, sketching late into the night, trying to capture the storm of emotions swirling inside me. My latest project was a series of cityscapes, each one infused with the loneliness of urban life. I drew our apartment building, its cracked facade glowing under streetlights, and I wondered if Lucas ever felt as trapped as I did. I wanted to ask him, to dig into the mystery of who he was. But every time I tried, his walls went back up. One evening, I came home to find a package on the kitchen counter, addressed to me. It was from my Mama Care package filled with cookies, a scarf, and a letter reminding me to call home. I smiled, the warmth of her words cutting through the chill of the apartment. Lucas was at the table, his laptop open, but he glanced at the package. "Your mom?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Yeah," I said, holding up a cookie. "Want one?" He hesitated, then took it, his fingers brushing mine for a split second. My heart stuttered, but he pulled back, biting into the cookie like it was nothing. "Thanks," he muttered, returning to his screen. I wanted to scream. How could he act so casual when every touch, every glance, felt like a spark? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment he'd wash my towel, the care in his hands so at odds with his cold demeanor. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. The next morning, I found him in the living room, reading a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. It was the first time I'd seen him with something other than a law book. "Good book?" I asked, sitting on the arm of the couch. He looked up, surprised. "Yeah. It's grounding." He closed it, his thumb marking the page. "You read it." "In high school," I said. "Scout's my favorite. She's fearless." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For a moment, we talked about the book, the conversation flowing easier than it ever had. I wanted to stay there, in that fragile bubble of connection. But then his phone buzzed, and the moment shattered. He glanced at it, his face hardening, and excused himself to his room. I didn't see the text, but I saw the effect. Whoever it was, they had power over him. I felt a pang of jealousy, then guilt. I had no claim to him, no right to care who was texting him. But I did care too much. I grabbed my sketchbook and drew him from memory, his sharp jaw, his guarded eyes, the way his hands gripped that book like it was a lifeline. When I finished, I stared at the page, my chest tight. I was falling for him, and it terrified me. The next day, I decided to take a risk. I left a sketch on the kitchen counter, a simple drawing of a coffee mug, with a note, "For Lucas. Thanks for the company." It was small, but it felt like bearing my soul. When I got home, the sketch was gone, and Lucas was in his room, door closed. I thought I'd misstepped, that I'd pushed too far. But later, I found the sketch taped to his door, a tiny "thanks" scrawled in the corner. My heart leapt. It was something, a thread to hold on to. Over the next week, we settled into a cautious rhythm. He'd leave the coffee pot on. I'd leave a cookie on his desk. Small gestures, building something fragile but real. Then, one night, everything changed again. I was working on a freelance logo design when Lucas came home, soaked from the rain. His face was pale, his eyes haunted. "You okay?" I asked, standing. He didn't answer. Instead, he dropped his bag and sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. I hesitated, then sat beside him, close but not touching. "Lucas, talk to me," I said softly. He shook his head, but after a long silence, he spoke. "My dad," he said, his voice raw. "He's not okay with who I am." The words hit me like a punch. I knew that pain, the sting of rejection from the people who were supposed to love you most. I wanted to reach for him, to tell him he wasn't alone. But I waited, letting him lead. "He found out I'm gay last year," Lucas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Kicked me out. I've been on my own since." My heart ached for him, for the weight he'd been carrying. I thought of my own family, flawed but accepting, and felt a surge of gratitude and guilt for assuming Lucas had it easier. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "You didn't deserve that." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine, and for the first time, I saw him really saw him. Not the cold roommate, but the man fighting to keep himself together. I reached out, my hand resting on his, and he didn't pull away. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Lucas's confession hung in the air like smoke, lingering long after he'd gone to bed. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his words echoing in my mind. He'd been kicked out, rejected by his own father, and yet he carried himself with such control, such guarded precision. I wanted to break through that facade, to show him he didn't have to face it alone. The next morning, he was back to his routine coffee, law books, silence, but I caught the way his shoulders sagged, the faint redness in his eyes. I didn't push. Instead, I left a sketch of a rainy street on his desk, a tiny figure under an umbrella with a note, "You're not alone." When I got home, the sketch was on his nightstand, a silent acknowledgement. Our apartment became a quiet battleground of gestures. I'd make extra dinner, leaving a plate for him. He'd tidy my art supplies when I left them scattered. Neither of us spoke about it, but the air felt different, less heavy, more alive. I started to see the man behind the mask, the way he'd hum softly when he thought I wasn't listening, the way he'd linger in the doorway before saying goodnight. One afternoon, I found him in the living room, staring at an old photo. It was him, younger, with a man who looked like an older version of him, same sharp jaw, same gray eyes. His father, I guessed. "You okay?" I asked, sitting across from him. He slid the photo into a book, his face unreadable. "Just remembering." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't pry, but the moment felt like a door cracking open. I told him about my own family, how my mom had cried when I came out, but hugged me tighter afterward. He listened, his eyes soft, and for once, he didn't look away. That night, we watched a movie together, some cheesy rom-com I'd picked to lighten the mood. Halfway through, he laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, and I felt my heart stutter. I wanted to freeze that moment, to hold on to the sound of his joy. When the movie ended, he didn't move, his shoulder brushing mine on the couch. "Thanks, Ethan," he said quietly. "For this." I smiled, my chest tight. Anytime. I wanted to say more, to ask about us, about what we were becoming, but I held back. He wasn't ready, and I wasn't sure I was either. But the space between us was shrinking, and I could feel it. The next day, I came home to find him cooking actual cooking, not just reheating takeout. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the apartment, and I raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Dinner," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Thought we could eat together." My heart did a flip. We sat at the table, plates of pasta between us, and really talked. He told me about law school, the pressure to be perfect, the fear of failing. I told him about my art, how it was the only place I felt free. For the first time, we weren't just roommates. We were something more. But the past has a way of creeping in. Later that week, I overheard him on the phone, his voice sharp and strained. "No, Dad, I'm not coming back. Stop calling." He hung up, his hands shaking, and I pretended I hadn't heard. But when he caught my eye, he didn't look away. "He wants to fix me," he said bitterly. "Like I'm broken." "You're not," I said fiercely, stepping closer. "You're not broken, Lucas." He stared at me, his eyes raw, and for a moment, I thought he'd kiss me. But he turned away, muttering something about needing air, and left the apartment. I stood there, my heart pounding, wondering if I'd pushed too far. When he came back, hours later, he looked drained but calmer. "I'm sorry," he said, standing in the doorway. "I'm not good at this. At letting people in." I nodded, my throat tight. "You don't have to be good at it," I said. "Just try." He smiled, a small, hesitant thing, and I felt hope flare in my chest. We didn't talk about it again, but something had shifted. The next morning, I found my towel folded neatly on my bed, freshly washed. I smiled, tracing the soft fabric, and knew we were moving towards something real. The folded towel on my bed felt like a promise, fragile but real. Lucas was trying, in his quiet, careful way, and I clung to that. But life in New York doesn't pause for fragile promises. My days were a blur of classes, deadlines, and late-night sketching, while Lucas buried himself in law school, his stress palpable. Yet, our apartment was no longer a war zone of silence. It was a place where hope flickered. One evening, I came home to find him pacing, his phone clutched tightly. "Everything okay?" I asked, dropping my bag. He shook his head, his jaw tight. "My dad's coming to the city. Wants to meet." My stomach dropped. I knew what that meant, the weight of expectation, the fear of rejection all over again. "Do you want to see him?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He sank onto the couch, rubbing his temples. "I don't know. Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell. Part of me wants him to understand." I sat beside him, close but not crowding. "You don't have to decide now," I said. "But whatever you choose, I'm here." He looked at me, his eyes searching, and nodded. "Thanks, Ethan." It was the first time he'd said my name with such softness, and it hit me like a wave. I wanted to hold him, to promise I'd shield him from the pain, but I knew I couldn't. All I could do was be there, The next day, he decided to meet his dad. He didn't ask me to come, but I saw the fear in his eyes as he left. I spent the day restless, sketching to distract myself. When he returned, he looked like a ghost, pale, hollow, defeated. He didn't listen, he said, his voice flat. Just kept saying I could change, that he'd help me. My heart broke for him. I stood, crossing the room, and pulled him into a hug. He stiffened at first, then melted into me, his breath shaky against my shoulder. "You're enough," I whispered. "Just as you are." He didn't speak, but his arms tightened around me, and we stood there, the world fading away. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was real, a moment of trust one hadn't thought we'd reach. After that, something shifted. Lucas started opening up, bit by bit. He'd tell me about his childhood in Chicago, how he'd loved books but hid them from his dad, who thought they were a waste of time. I shared my own stories growing up in Ohio, feeling like I didn't belong until I found art. We'd talk late into the night, the apartment glowing with a warmth I hadn't thought possible. One night, he showed me an old journal, filled with poems he'd written in high school. They were raw, aching, full of a longing he'd never voiced. "I stopped writing when I came out," he said, his voice quiet. Felt like I didn't deserve to. I took his hand, my thumb brushing his knuckles. "You deserve everything, Lucas. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He looked at me, his eyes bright with something I couldn't name. Then, slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine. It wasn't like the first time, frantic, fueled by wine and impulse. This was soft, deliberate, a question and an answer. When we pulled apart, he smiled, and I felt my heart crack open. But life isn't a fairy tale. The next morning, I woke to a text from my mom. "Call me. It's important." Her voice was strained when I called, and she told me my dad was sick, cancer, caught late. I felt the ground shift beneath me. I needed to go home, to Ohio, to be with them. When I told Lucas, his face fell, but he nodded. "Go," he said. "Family matters." I packed a bag, my mind spinning. As I headed for the door, Lucas stopped me, pressing something into my hand, a folded sketch, one I'd left on his desk weeks ago. "Come back, okay?" he said, his voice rough. I nodded, unable to speak, and left, the weight of his words carrying me through the city. Ohio felt like stepping into a different life. The quiet streets, the familiar creak of my childhood home was comforting and suffocating all at once. My dad was weaker than I'd expected, his face gaunt, but his spirit stubborn. I spent my days helping my mom, sitting with him, trying to make sense of a world where he might not be around much longer. I texted Lucas daily, small updates to keep the thread between us alive. He'd respond with short messages, "Hope you're okay. Tell your dad to hang in there," but I could feel the distance growing. Not because he wanted it, but because life was pulling us in different directions. I missed him, missed our apartment, missed the fragile connection we'd built. One night, my dad called me to his room. "Ethan," he said, his voice raspy, "you've always been brave. Braver than me." He paused, his eyes distant. "I wasn't there for you when you came out. I should have been." Tears stung my eyes. I'd never expected an apology, not from him. I took his hand, and we sat in silence, the weight of years lifting just a little. When I returned to New York 2 weeks later, I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. Lucas was waiting at the apartment, a rare smile breaking through his usual reserve. "You're back," he said, and the relief in his voice warmed me. He'd kept the place tidy, my towel folded on my bed, a small stack of sketches on my desk. It was his way of saying he'd missed me. We fell back into our rhythm, but it was different now, deeper, more intentional. We'd cook together, watch movies, talk about everything and nothing. One night, he read me one of his old poems, his voice steady but vulnerable. It was about a boy lost in a storm, searching for light. "That's you," I said softly, and he didn't deny it. But the past wasn't done with us. One morning, I found Lucas staring at his phone, his face pale. "He's here again," he said. His dad, back in the city, demanding another meeting. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear I'd felt facing my own family. "Do you want me to come with you?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I do." We met his dad at a diner, a stern man with Lucas's eyes, but none of his warmth. The conversation was brutal, his dad preaching about fixing him, Lucas fighting to hold his ground. I stayed quiet, my hand on his under the table, grounding him. When his dad left, Lucas was shaking, but he squeezed my hand. "Thank you," he whispered. That night, we didn't talk about it. Instead, we curled up on the couch, his head on my shoulder, and watched the city lights through the window. I felt his walls crumbling, not all at once, but piece by piece. I knew it wouldn't be easy as pain, my dad's illness, the weight of our pasts, but for the first time, I believed we could face it together. The diner meeting left Lucas quieter than usual, but not distant. He'd reach for my hand when we were alone, his touch a silent thank you. I could feel him trying, inching closer to the vulnerability he'd spent so long hiding. I wanted to meet him halfway, to show him I was all in, but I was scared, too scared of losing him, scared of my dad's illness pulling me back to Ohio. One evening, I found him in the bathroom, washing my towel again. I leaned against the doorframe, smiling. "You know we have a washing machine, right?" He froze, then laughed a rare, bright sound. "It's not about the towel," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "It's about caring." My heart swelled, and I stepped closer, kissing him softly. This time, he didn't pull away. We started spending more time together, not just as roommates, but as something undefined, something real. We'd walk through Brooklyn, sharing coffee and stories, our hands brushing as we navigated crowded streets. He told me about his dreams of being a public defender, fighting for people who'd been cast aside. I showed him my portfolio, the cityscapes I'd poured my heart into. We were building something, fragile but strong, like a sketch coming to life. But life doesn't let you stay in those moments. My mom called again, her voice breaking. My dad's condition had worsened, and they needed me home. I told Lucas, expecting him to shut down, but he surprised me. "I'll come with you," he said, his voice steady. "If you want me to." I stared at him, tears pricking my eyes. "You don't have to," I said, but he shook his head. "I want to." We took a bus to Ohio, the hours passing in quiet conversation and shared silence. When we arrived, my mom hugged Lucas like he was family, and my dad managed a weak smile. "You're the roommate?" he asked, his voice faint. Lucas nodded, and I saw something soften in his eyes. Being there, seeing my family's love despite their flaws, seemed to shift something in him. We spent a week in Ohio, helping my parents, talking late into the night. Lucas opened up about his mom, who'd passed when he was a kid, and how his dad's rejection had felt like losing her all over again. I held him, promising I'd never let him feel that alone again. When we returned to New York, our apartment felt different, less like a shared space, more like a home. Back in New York, our lives settled into a new rhythm. Lucas was still guarded, but he was trying, really trying. He'd leave notes on my sketches, Small praises that made my heart race. I'd cook his favorite meals, watching his face light up with every bite. We were falling into something deeper, something neither of us had expected. One night, he pulled out his journal again, reading me a new poem he'd written. It was about a boy finding home in another's eyes, and I knew it was about us. I kissed him, slow and sure, and he kissed me back, his hand steady. We didn't need words that night, just each other. But the world doesn't stop for love. My dad's health was declining, and I was torn between New York and Ohio. Lucas saw it, the way I'd stare at my phone, waiting for bad news. "You need to go?" he said one morning, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll be here when you get back." I nodded, my throat tight, and booked a ticket. In Ohio, I spent every moment with my dad, cherishing the time we had left. He told me he was proud of me, of the man I'd become. I told him about Lucas, about the hope I felt. He smiled, weak but genuine, and said, "Hold on to that." When I returned to New York, Lucas was waiting at the bus station, his arms open. I ran to him, and we held each other, the city fading around us. My dad passed a month later. The grief was heavy, but Lucas was my anchor. He held me through the nights I couldn't sleep, listened when I needed to talk, and stayed quiet when I didn't. He was there, steady and real, and I realized I loved him not just for who he was, but for who we were becoming together. One evening, I found him in the bathroom, washing my towel again. I laughed, tears in my eyes. "You're ridiculous," I said, wrapping my arms around him. He turned, smiling, and kissed me. "It's not about the towel," he said again, his voice soft. "It's about you." We moved forward, together. Lucas started writing again, his poems filling with hope. I poured my grief into my art, creating a series dedicated to my dad. We faced our fears, his dad's rejection, my loss, and found strength in each other. The apartment, once cold and silent, was now warm with laughter, love, and the promise of tomorrow. We weren't perfect. We argued. We stumbled. But we always came back to each other. And every time I saw my towel, neatly folded or carefully washed, I was reminded of the man who'd taught me that love isn't loud, it's in the quiet, steady acts that mean everything. We'd built a home, not just in our apartment, but in each other, and that was enough.